afternoon, everyone. As I mentioned, my name is Jonathan Iglesias. I'm a prevention practice advisor for NRCDV and a program manager at the Action Alliance in Virginia, the Virginia Coalition. I've been working in partnership with NRCDV on this Prevent IPV project for about 3 years and have worked both in Virginia and Washington state-based anti-violence movements focused on prevention work. We also have with us Joanne, who has been working on Prevent IPV for a number of years and is with the New York Coalition. She's moderating chat and probably a familiar face and name to most people here. Thank you, Joanne, for doing that. And Justine is going to be our tech guru, so if anything goes awry, then she'll be fixing that for us and is helping to make sure that everything runs smoothly today. So thanks, y'all. So before we jump in and start learning about the important work of the Idaho Coalition and Girls for Gender Equity and all the amazing things that they're doing to center girls of color in the racial and gender justice movements and dialogue, I want to briefly go through some of the offerings and resources made available through Prevent IPV for those who might not be familiar. So a little bit about the history of Prevent IPV. This was formed in 2011, or the IPV Prevention Council, which is kind of the organizing committee of Prevent IPV, was formed in 2011 and is a voluntary association of domestic violence coalitions. And they have a vision to create a collaborative and sustained primary prevention effort nationally that leads social change around preventing IPV in communities. And here is just a quick slide on what their goals and purpose are. Again, kind of a national unified voice for prevention, and these two purposes being promoting prevention as a sustainable priority for coalitions and local domestic violence programs, and then also proactively engaging federal partners, funders, and allied organizations to promote IPV prevention as a critical component of ending DV and SV. This is who is on the steering committee leadership of the IPV Prevention Council. Some folks that probably some of us know from coalitions across the nation. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Prevent IPV, there are a number of resources that are offered on that site. And it's a lot more than a site, actually. It's a newsletter. It's an online presence in terms of discussion on listservs. It is a kind of constant tools inventory, resources being updated. So one of the things that you'll notice when you go to preventipv.org is that you can click through all those different sections and find all the different things that you need there in terms of history, in terms of our connection to some of the CDC prevention work that's happening, and some of the other national coalitions who are doing really critical work around prevention. And some of the things that might be of particular use to folks who are doing prevention work either at the state level or in communities is this wonderful tool that we have called the Tools Inventory, which is this kind of comprehensive library of self-submitted prevention projects, campaigns, and materials that have been promoted or been submitted for use by practitioners in the field. And so that's kind of what I mean by self-submitted. And it goes through a vetting process and then an organization process to basically be something that's easy to find and easy to access and easy to use for folks. So if you go to the tools inventory on preventipv.org, what you'll notice is that you can basically type into the search bar anything that you want. Say you're looking for an anti-oppression toolkit for using in workshops with youth ages 14 to 16. You can put all of that criteria into the tools inventory, and then it'll auto-populate this list of things that kind of meet that criteria. So it's a really wonderful resource, and one of the things that you'll find as our presenters are discussing their work is that some of the materials that they might be discussing and some of the resources they might be discussing are actually things that we can access in that tools inventory space on preventipv.org. Another thing that we offer is there is an engagement section there that is constantly being built up and is changing and is intended to be a space for folks to think through how to make intentional and strategic partnerships around prevention with either funders or with folks in community foundations and businesses, or maybe with advocates who are doing a lot of work around crisis intervention and maybe are wanting to shift the framework to more of a prevention school of thought. And so you'll find videos there that are kind of testament to some of the wonderful partnerships that exist that highlight how those things came to be and provide us with a blueprint of how to maybe do that in our own work. And I encourage you to go look there as well. If there are any questions about that, I'm happy to troubleshoot or answer questions at the end of the presentation or by email. I'll give you our contact information as well. But I want to go ahead and move on to make sure that our presenters are able to share all the fabulous work that they're doing and have enough time to do that. So today we are extremely fortunate and so grateful to have both Joanne Smith and Kelly Miller with us. And Joanne is the founder and executive director of Girls for Gender Equity, and Kelly is the executive director of the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. Joanne is, again, the founder and executive director, is responsible for moving girls and gender equity closer to its mission through strategic planning, development, and leadership cultivation. Ms. Smith is a Haitian-American social worker born in New York City. She founded GGE in 2001 with the support of the Open Society Foundations to end gender-based violence and promote gender, race, and class equity. She's a staunch human rights advocate. Smith is the co-chair of the nation's first Young Women's Initiative for cis, trans, and GNC girls of color, spearheaded by our speaker, Melissa Mark Viverto in New York City. In June 2015, Smith led the first national listening session to inform the Advancing Equity for Women and Girls of Color agenda for the White House Council on Women and Girls. She's a part of the first Move to End Violence cohort, which is, I think a lot of folks might be familiar with that here, and for those of you who aren't, you'll become more familiar with this as the presenters go through their work. And she's just done an incredible amount of work, and again, we're incredibly grateful to have her here. Kelly Miller is the ED of the Idaho Coalition and envisions compassionate communities with social equity and collective liberation for all human beings, where everyone can thrive and reach their full potential. Kelly is currently the ED and an alumni cohort of the Move to End Violence, again, something that we'll be hearing a little bit more about. After 30 years in anti-violence work as an attorney, prosecutor, and activist, she has been on a transformational journey that has brought clarity to her purpose of mutual liberation to the last girl and a deep understanding that liberation has to begin with ourselves. She has come to learn that how we are is even more important than what we do. I think that we have a lot to learn from these two, and again, are just so grateful to have them here today. And I could go on and on and on and talk about just how wonderful they are and all the incredible work that they've done. But I want to give them the floor and let them go ahead and talk to you themselves. So Kelly and Joanne, again, we're excited to have you both with us today, and now you have the floor.
Hi, this is Joanne. Thank you for having me. Thinking about all of the organizations that are on the line right now, I have a question to ask. How many of the organizations here directly work with young women of color? I ask that within the feedback box, you select yes or no. If you directly work with young women of color within your programming, within your organization, that is the work of Girls for Gender Equity. So Girls for Gender Equity is an intergenerational organization. We lead campaigns and programs using a four-pronged strategy of youth development, intergenerational practice, interagency collaborations, and developing social justice curricula to help move us closer to this mission that you see. We really do so by really being the work, right? The personal is political. So we carry feminist values and the expectation of equality around gender, race, class, heterosexist privilege. We have a majority women of color-led organization and a commitment to really remove obstacles for girls and women of color while ultimately advancing the entire community. we're a leading advocacy and service delivery organization. So we hold both advocacy and direct service to include voices and experiences of young women of color within our current racial justice movement. And again, we do so intergenerationally, and we center cis and trans girls and young women of color, as well as gender nonconforming young people. A few useful terms, definitions that I'll be using throughout this webinar are cisgender person, so a term for someone who has a gender identity that aligns with what they were assigned at birth, as opposed to a trans person, who someone identifies differently than the gender they were assigned at birth. Gender nonconforming refers to people who do not follow other people's ideas or stereotypes of what gender should look like or act like. And of course, intersectionality, a theory that seeks to examine the ways in which various socially and culturally constructed categories interact on multiple levels to manifest themselves. So I am, as you heard, I am a woman, I'm Haitian, I show up in this work black, I show up in the world black, and these identities actually intersect, especially around systems and how systems then support or don't support the advancement. So thinking of what we'll go through today, I'd love to bring you through the arc of the work that we do at Girls for Gender Equity, as well as why. Bring you through how it is working with young people, working with young girls of color can really support the advancement of racial equity and gender equity throughout the 21st century. So one of the things you see here, sorry it's a little blurry, but is our theory of change process. And with our theory of change process, we go from individual to global, understanding we span from micro to macro, that we can support through our education program, through our advocacy program, through our Young Women's Advisory Council and our alumni program, young people at their core who need services, as well as the advocacy and systemic work that adds to the work of the world and adds to the larger movement. 4 of our underpinnings within our theory of change are strength-based and ecosystemic social work approach, positive youth development, Black feminist theory, and transformative education for liberation. We have a holistic after-school program and 2 community middle schools 5 days a week called Urban Leaders Academy. It's for boys and girls. So much of the work that they do is around consciousness raising, is around academic achievement, social justice education. We do workshops and trainings. Within our Sisters in Strength Youth Organizing program, this program is for girls. It's a 2 to 3 year program where our young people come in and have identified that they want to be advocates. They want to be Sisters in Strength Youth Organizers. They see themselves in the work and they want to be a part of the work. They receive a stipend to lead advocacy campaigns, but also receive direct service where they build sisterhood together, get support around college, get support around high school, even whatever is affecting them in life. They're not identified by whatever issues they're facing, but as we work with them, then we come to find out whatever issues they're facing in their life, whether it be foster care, whether it be homelessness, whether it be substance abuse or parenting, and they still remain a Sisters in Strength Youth Organizer as we navigate the systems of support to support them. We also lead at Girls for Gender Equity Participatory Action Research. So participatory action research combines empirical data and collection with reflection on how one's personal experiences are connected to the larger societal issues. And once you find that out, you bring back the information that has impacted the community for the community to really create effective change on the critical issue. So you, 1, identify what the issue is, you research it, number 2, you bring back the analysis to the community, and then the community decides on the action needed to then move forward and solve that issue. And then you reflect and evaluate what worked, what didn't, and this loop you do again and again. And participatory action research is really a space where our young people in our community, and especially communities of color that often feel silenced around research, because research is seen as something that needs to happen within universities and by experts who come in and tell you what the community needs to do. It has really validated our young people in our community as experts in their experiences, as well as researchers and teachers, right, who can share perspective because of their lived experiences and can share also solutions because of their lived experiences. So for us, participatory action research really grounds a lot of the work that we have done within Girls for Gender Equity. One of the areas of work that we have done that was really built and developed after our work around sexual harassment was work to address school pushout. School pushout is defined as systemic and institutional factors and practices that prevent or discourage young people from completing their education. So as you see on the school pushout wheel, so many of these factors, pregnancy, parenting, family responsibilities, which we like to call gender-specific burdens, harassment and bullying, and this is where sexual harassment really came in as a factor, especially for gender nonconforming youth, trans youth, and girls, and especially girls of color, who would identify that whenever they would, and these are girls in our program, that whenever they would then retaliate against sexual harassment, because of zero tolerance policies within schools, they were also punished. So it was never defined as it's sexual harassment and this is Title IX violation. It was defined as, a fight. And because of the policies, then all parties had to be punished, suspended, or expelled. And so as these factors started to come up based on our sexual harassment work, it was really clear as we started to poll our young people and get a sense of what was happening in their daily lives and in school, that they were deeply impacted by school pushout. Nearly half of transgender students report regularly skipping school because of safety concerns. Nearly 1 in 6 transgender and gender nonconforming students face harassment so severe they're forced to leave school. Sexual harassment and gender violence as forms of school pushout is often overshadowed by the school-to-prison pipeline and what young men of color experience going to school, but we know that young women of color are a growing body of young people entering the juvenile justice system. As we continue to do our work within our Urban Leaders Academy, where we do serve boys, we quickly were learning that policymakers and philanthropists and media and key public leaders were shedding a light on the racial and economic injustices faced by boys of color. Advocates for boys, they've succeeded in soliciting significant public-private investment and targeted at increasing educational and economic opportunities on their behalf. I mean, us as an organization felt it with, the increased demand for boys programming at Girls for Gender Equity, and the investments were mostly urgently needed, right? We need programming that addresses healthy masculinity and supports the development of boys of color. It's often seen as insufficient in scale as far as a systemic and institutional approach to addressing the needs of racial injustice that boys face. And it oftentimes it doesn't really support the actual hands-on skills that boys really need. And when we think about the support, specifically here in New York City, 4 years ago our mayor started a Young Men's Initiative. It was a cross-agency enterprise, and at the time it was tackling the crisis facing its New York City young black men and boys. For the most part, it was tackling at the time ending or at least combating recidivism into the juvenile justice and prison. From that framework, My Brother's Keeper was created, and this was a $300 million national initiative that our president created to really address the persistent opportunity gaps faced by men and boys of color. While that was happening, we know that girls of color, in particular black girls in the United States, are in crisis. They face significant barriers to education achievement and economic political equality, and are recipients of deeply embedded racial and gender biases in the media, public policy, research, as I said, in education, and in philanthropy. Some of the facts that I'd love to share, and don't worry, I won't read all of this, but because we'll share this slide deck, I really wanted to provide facts in every area. So some of the facts that I'll share are Black girls, 12%, American Indian, Alaska Native girls, 7%, and Hispanic girls, 4%, are more likely to be suspended from school than their white counterparts at 2%. Students of color with disabilities are suspended and expelled at a rate roughly twice that of our non-disabled peers. Within economic security, young women of color face high poverty rates and harsh economic prospects in adulthood. Black and Latino women comprise 86% of female-headed households with children under 10 years old here in New York City. That means they are 3 times more likely to live in poverty. As we move into the child welfare system, so it's like every system will hit, right? So as we move into the child welfare system, girls of color are overrepresented in the city's child welfare system, and it often fails to provide girls with safety and support services to recover from abuse and trauma that led them into the system to begin with. In addition, disruptions in education and lack of connection to permanent home for older girls and lack of LGBTQ affirming services remain significant challenges for girls in the city's foster care system. There's a historic lack of integrating gender into efforts to redress racial and socioeconomic inequalities, and it's resulted in a higher rate of poverty for women and girls of color. Black girls represent 36% of females in the juvenile justice system. More than 60% of LGBT youth in the juvenile justice system are Black and Latino. And once in the system's really ill-equipped. I mean, we all know the systems are not trauma-informed systems, and we're moving from a framework of saying we need trauma-informed systems to saying we need healing systems. But if you have this container that is so far away from even being trauma-informed, it's impossible to jump to healing without dismantling the system. So once inside of this juvenile justice or injustice system, girls of color oftentimes, don't receive the mental health services, don't receive sexual assault or abuse services, or even ask the right questions around what it is that led them, what happened to them, what it is that led them into this system and has them there that day, so that they can receive the support that they actually need so that they can be out of the system. As a matter of fact, reports like the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, the Girl Story, really elevates girls who experience sexual assault are routinely placed in the juvenile justice system because of their victimization. Sexual abuse is one of the primary indicators and predictors of girls' entry into the juvenile justice system. Now, this fact, I think, is something that, as preventive organizations, we should be really screaming from the mountaintop, right? Sexual abuse is one of the primary predictors of girls' entry into the JJ system. And so many times within our education system, within homes, within conversations around sexual assault and strategies to combat violence, we're not talking about child sexual abuse. We're not addressing it, with children. We're not addressing it with families and with communities and schools, even though we know these facts and we know the trajectory of someone who has been victimized as a child when it comes to child sexual abuse, and the chances that they will be then sexually abused or assaulted as they move through every stage of development. And so in closing this out, a 16-year study published in Pediatrics found that girls exiting the JJ system are 5 times more likely to die a violent death by age 25 than their female peers who are not justice involved, while boys are 3 times more likely to die than their peers who are not justice involved. And the same study found that Latinos are 9 times more likely to experience the same, while Latinos are 5 times more likely. These striking findings in regards to the unique impact of justice involvement on mortality rates of young women of color demand targeting. And they demand targeting because we know, right, we follow the Say Her Name campaign. We know names like Ayanna Stanley Jones right, who was killed at 7 years old by a Detroit police officer SWAT team. We know Rekia Boyd, who was killed by an off-duty police detective who said he feared for his life but was actually aiming for the young man next to her. We know Yvette Smith and Katherine Johnston, and on and on and on. Isla Nettles. We know that black women, girls of color, at every stage of their life, right, are seen as a threat and in danger of the same police violence and institutional violence that men and boys of color are in fear of and in danger of. And so as an organization with our young people, right, understanding the conditions, understanding what they're up against, we created a national coalition and campaign. We created it with activists, academics, scholars, parents, other stakeholders, to really collaborate and say, while My Brother's Keeper is happening, we can't wait for our young people to be seen and for girls and women to be a part of this racial justice movement. We will not be forgotten. We will be centered, and we will address racial inequity now, not once our boys and men are safe. We created also town halls and listening sessions, calls to action, right, so that we could stop the crude and unjust biological line between children of color, to really show that, that when you reinforce an initiative that, excludes half the population, it really just reinforces a longstanding societal ambivalence towards the equally urgent and pervasive inequality facing girls of color. We marched and we lifted their names. We said their names, right? Say her name, Ayanna Stanley Jones. Say her name, Isla Nettles. We marched with our Black Lives Matter family. We marched with community. And wherever there was a march, we were sure to bring our women and girls, our femmes, our gender nonconforming youth to the center so that they would not be forgotten and we would not be forgotten within this racial justice movement. We hosted listening sessions where our young people shared, how it is that they are impacted by these systems. And this listening session was the first for the White House Council on Women and Girls, and really helped to shape the Advancing Equity agenda, national federal agenda to address the issues of girls and women of color. We testified at the White House. We shared not only our stories, but then our strategies, right? Because so many of our young people have stories to share, but also are able to contribute to, how it is that change needs to happen if they're also asked, right? And where it is, they are the ones with the best strategy because they are the ones who are the experts who just recently went through the conditions. And for many of them, they were still going through the conditions. And so they informed so much of, what systemically needs to happen as well as, what programmatically and resource-wise needs to happen. Our young people also, came to center within the Young Women's Initiative. And this Young Women's Initiative was the first Young Women's Initiative in the nation to center the needs of cis, trans, and gender nonconforming young people. With this initiative, our speaker, Melissa Marx-Viverito, a Latina woman, really put skin in the game to be able to say, over the next 2 years, New York City will invest $10 million through city council funding and $10 million through a matching philanthropic effort, really address the needs of girls of color 12 to 24 years old. As an initiative, we went through a planning process where we came up with 99 recommendations. Over 300 people participated in this initiative, and we came up with 99 recommendations through 5 work groups. As you see here, health, community support, opportunity, anti-violence, economic workforce and development, and education. Our young people within the Young Women's Advisory Council, as you see over in the circle there, they really sat within every one of these work groups, and we're the ones to have the last word on the recommendations that landed within the Young Women's Initiative then now report, which you can find on She Will Be NYC. And through that process, the Young Women's Advisory process, which really is a participatory governance process, such an important strategy to not only building power and building, policy, but also self-esteem and mentoring and opportunity. So many of these young people you see in this Young Women's Advisory picture, did not trust government and structures, and didn't understand government and structures. And maybe some still don't, right, trust government and structures, but they could at least see themselves as changing certain areas and having a voice, as well as, again, 300 people meeting so many people intergenerationally who actually help to shift and support the trajectory of their life. So people that they will forever grow up with doing this work. So many jobs happen through the initiative. Young people went to the White House through the initiative, and we continue at Girls for Gender Equity to lead the Young Women's Advisory Council. What we have done is share some of our strategies around building power, a Young Women's Advisory Council report on our website. We've also connected folks nationally and would love to connect disconnected people nationally so that in other places we can have a Young Women's Initiative and Young Women's Advisory Council, and it doesn't have to be recreating the wheel. It also is a space where, it's 25 young people, 25 and under, who are really leading the way. They are the ones who lead the initiative as far as the Young Women's Advisory Council, and they're the ones who decide on the strategies and decide on the areas that they'll work on, and they're the ones who would come and visit your Young Women's Advisory Council if you so choose to develop one in your city or space. We've also testified within the Congressional Caucus on Black women and girls. With our young people, one of the most important things to do, and when we talk about centering girls of color within the racial justice movement, is to be able to vision, to be able to have a vision of what it means to be liberated, what it means to have dignity. Within our schools, because we do lead school push-out campaigns and we're part of national coalitions, our young people developed a School Our Girls Deserve vision and School Our Girls Deserve policy book, as well as really giving voice through 10 visioning sessions of over 100 people to what it looks like to feel like you have dignity walking through school and feel like you're loved and cared for walking through school. Our young people, go and get media opportunities. When they call for me, many times it's given to them because young people can speak for themselves. So when you talk about how do you prevent, how do you create opportunities, how do you create conditions for young people to really shift and to do that intergenerationally, to really shift structures, you don't do the same old thing. You give them space and really create opportunities for them to shine, for them to share their knowledge, and you do it unapologetically, and you allow them to do it and fail and do it and be successful. Within philanthropy, one of the strategies that we embarked on is really aligning, and this is a new strategy for many of us. Me as an executive director of a nonprofit, it took years to get to the point of seeing myself as actually a peer or a counterpart to a philanthropic partner. First, starting within this nonprofit industrial complex, these are the people we have to impress, right? And there's a shift in that thinking, especially when we have a shared vision and alignment, that we are in this work together, and we are working towards liberation and racial and gender justice and equity together, and we all are playing our part. And so Nova Foundation has been one of the foundations really leading the way in that strategy, convening 100 grant makers. Within their Grant Makers of Color site, you can see video and again of young people, intergenerational dialogue around what it means to support girls and women of color. They've also made a $90 million commitment to girls of color. They have an indigenous communities in North America portfolio. And here in New York, I'm very lucky to be in New York. Here in New York, they also bought a women's building, formerly the Bayview Women's Prison, that was shut down when we had a Hurricane Sandy. And luckily it was shut down and they were able to buy it. And now we're reimagining and redeveloping what it means to feel safe within a women's building and creating that building. I'll go through these slides rather quickly to give Kelly a chance to jump in, but also creating conferences where unapologetically, and especially within this, anti-black state that we live in, and not just New York, but country and globe that we live in, centering black girls, leading a 3-day Black Girl Movement conference with over 1,000 participants over 3 days, really elevating the needs as well as the cultural creation and brilliance and genius of black girls. Our black girls created a Bill of Rights, understanding that, at the time that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were created, there were no women, there were no black girls chiming in on what a Declaration of Freedom and Humanity would look like or sound like or be like, and so that they would create their own. And within that, really being able to highlight their right to education and information about African and black history and her story, their right to express their blackness without being judged, their right to feel safe and have physical, emotional, and mental health honored and protected and nurtured, their right to real sex education and contraception, not to just be seen as, welfare queens or seen as, girls who have the potential to be pregnant, the right to agency and control over their own bodies in every space, and the right to justice and reparations, the right to really be able to be supported in response to harm and sexual assault, the right to play and have fun. This is one thing our 5-year-old black girl wrote: I want to play and have fun. The right to community and sisterhood, support from other girls, and the right to be exactly who she is, free from stereotype and insecurity, in her full, unique self. So in closing, some concrete steps as you're thinking about girls of color who really face deep systemic injustices in schools and communities, and how you can prioritize them. Here are some things that you can do. One, I'd love to see the poll on how many people work with girls and women of color, but one is listen to your girls and young women of color that you serve within the families. Many times it's not what they say that shows what they need, but what they do. And if within your programming you're not understanding why they're not coming, and you're not understanding why things are happening, then you're not listening, you're not seeing, and you're not respecting what it is that they're showing you. Many times they're showing you that whatever services you have may not really culturally fit them, may not be adequate to their needs, may not be the things that they want. Trust them in when they say what it is that they want. Listen. Ensure that you work with them through an intersectional lens. So intersectional lens is not just having somebody in place who fits the gender, race, class bill, but a real cultural understanding and appreciation. And not just one, right? Having a community of staff that really reflects your values of supporting and wanting to be in community with people of color, and staff that are also in decision-making capacity, who hold power as well as hold economic security within your agencies. Challenge your own implicit bias about people of color. Have a conversation about anti-black racism and sexism. There are so many tools at your disposal in Google and YouTube and local agencies. I can post an implicit bias tool that you can actually take and get a sense of what implicit bias governs your thought. And this is something you could keep private, but you could learn then what to do to counter that, because I don't think anyone wants to be racist, but implicit bias is something that impacts all of us. And support the leadership of girls and women of color within the work of your agency. If you have girls and women of color who are interns, and that's as far as it goes, how do you support their leadership development and their trajectory as leaders within your space? And you do this because I'm certain that all social justice efforts benefit when we invest in young women's leadership, whether we're talking about immigration rights, racial justice, environmental justice, where we invest in girls and women's leadership and organize with an intersectional approach. We are much more successful at advancing every single social justice issue. This, I promise you, So thank you for taking the time to listen to some of the work that we do, and I'd love to pass the mic to Kelly and then get a chance to answer questions on the other side.
We did have some questions.
Great.
One of the questions in the public chat was, how would you suggest centering girls of color and trans folks in an organization that has mostly white folks in a way that is intentional and understood as a priority?
Sure. So the beautiful thing is the work that Kelly will talk about will really talk a lot to how she has done that as a white person and as a white organization, or having predominantly white people at her organization in Idaho. But the first thing I would say is you begin obviously with yourselves, right, and having within the organization, because so many times the intention is there, the desire is there, and the skills need to catch up to where there is, so that it doesn't become a place where you're really bringing in young people and centering young people who are cis and trans, and then they have to teach you, right? You want to come, you want to do the work to create the conditions for cis and trans, gender nonconforming young people of color to want to be in the space, to want to do the work with you as well. And so that's, I think, the first thing. We often don't start with ourselves in our own house and our own bias, which is why I always name the implicit bias tool, to really understand what it is that you're walking around with. Because if you don't, do that for yourself first, then you're unable to forgive yourself, and then you're then trying to make it up, and 9 times out of 10, then it's just going to make it worse over and over again because you don't fully understand where that's coming from, or how to undo that and those skills to undo that. So I would also begin with an undoing racism training, and I know Kelly again is going to go a lot deeper into the strategies and the ways in which her organization did it. So I'll just stop there, and if there's another question on the other side, then I'll jump back in. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm so excited to be here in conversation with you, and just really appreciate everything Joanne had to share. And I continue to learn and follow Joanne's leadership in the country in terms of engaging cis and trans girls and young women of color. So the question that I'm going to really talk about is, how did a mainstream state coalition begin the shift towards really centering our work on what we refer to as the last girl, which is very conceptual, but it is the girl or the young woman or the cis or trans individual in our community that's most pushed out, has the least access for resources. And so when I think about the parable of the river, which I know many folks who do prevention are familiar with, that we talk about how they were on the bank of the river pulling people out one after another. And when I tell you in Idaho that the rivers are wide and deep in some places, and in the middle of the river you have many currents. And so I think what I have come to understand through my work at Move to End Violence and being part of Cohort 2 is that we were not even addressing the individuals in the middle of the river. We were not pulling out anyone in the middle of the river. And for me, the middle of the river represents the multiple systemic oppressions that are inseparable from people's lives, that you could be experiencing gender violence and racism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism, all the different ways as human beings that we devalue one another based on identities and characteristics. And so when I think about our prevention work, it is the very same thing. And, the parable of the river is, why are all these individuals floating down the river, and why not go upstream to find out why they're jumping into the river or being tossed into the river in the first place? And so when I think about that parable of the river and upstream and prevention work, it's that same thing. Who is it that's in the middle of the river upstream that's being put in the middle when they're having to deal with so many different barriers that the dominant culture has created for individuals who have identities or characteristics that are other than a white heterosexual male dominant culture? And so for us, that really began the trajectory in terms of shifting our work. At the Idaho Coalition, much like other mainstream organizations, as we were going into these deep conversations, and I really appreciate that Joanne said you have to do this with a lot of humility and dignity and understanding. And so we have spent several years now really diving deep into understanding racism and what does that look like. And it looks like anything from reading books by Daryl C. Wing, Undoing Racism, or Paul Kivel's work, to making sure that we're getting our news from sources other than mainstream. So that means I subscribe to Color Lines and Everyday Feminism and other media and non-web-based news sources that can give me the perspective and the voices, particularly of women of color. At the same time, we're also, deepening our thinking and our thoughts through watching documentaries. Most recently, and our staff hasn't watched it yet together, but 13th, it is just essential that people are taking the time to deepen their understanding on how racism in particular has really impacted our communities and our culture and really created this, incarceral state where we over-incarcerate at such high levels. And at the same time, we have to really, probably more important than anything, is we have to have deep conversations, because information is just information unless you make sense of it and you integrate it into your way of being. And so as an organization, we went through a theory of change process, which is just fancy organizational development language for answering those big questions like, why do we exist? What is the issue that we exist to address? What are the values of our organization? What is most essential to us in terms of how we are? And understanding that how we are when we do this work is as important as the work that we do. And understanding that we have strategies. What are those strategies? And then what are we working towards? So during the theory of change process, which really has gotten us to what I would talk about being our North Star, is liberation for the last girl. When I think about the last girl, and I think for everybody just to understand that it's very conceptual. It's not a literal last girl, but it's just understanding that in every community that we have individual human beings that are pushed out, that have the least access to resources and opportunities. And if we could center our work, really center our work on reaching the last girl, then that work completely shifts. And this is a challenge for the prevention community, because I know most of our prevention work over the years has been what preventionists would refer to as universal, kind of reaching the largest audience. And what I will tell you, if you continue, and we decided if we continue to have a universal approach, that we would never reach the last girl. And the last girl for us are almost always cis and trans young women of color. And so thinking about our work has really shifted. An example of some of the components of our theory of change that really have really given us a solid foundation for this are our values. And among our values, some that would be familiar and probably expected for many state coalitions, things like compassion, but other ones around interconnection and understanding how, as human beings, that we're interdependent, and that the importance of authentic mutual relationships with one another and our earth are essential. Other values that might be different from some other coalitions would be ones around leading boldly, knowing that you have to take risks and you have to be open to possibilities and going into the unknown. Others would include social equity and collective liberation, which are two keystone foundations for our organization. Understanding that equity is different than equality, which is sameness. Equity for me really brings home that understanding that you have to understand and hear and see the lived experiences of historically marginalized communities, because equity is the only way that's going to really begin to shift the way our culture works, because equity means what do people need to thrive. Our value around collective liberation, for me, that's one that holds just so much power. And that's just about moving forward together, knowing that our mutual humanity is connected to the liberation of the most marginalized person in our community, which we define as the last girl. When we think about the last girl, for this is like our North Star. It's our navigational tool. And so when we're thinking about the work that we're doing, how can we actually center the last girl in our work, whether or not it's young girls and women, who are from racial or ethnic minorities in Idaho, which often looks like Latina and Native American youth, or young women who are refugees or immigrants. It can also be individuals with disabilities or from the LGBTQ population. So the last girl is something that for us has really grounded our work, and we've begun this journey, and we're still very much in process in terms of both internal work, which had to be really deep. I mean, we spent, I think I mentioned, like a year and a half, 2 years and it is ongoing. It is not ever a one and done. We've had Monica Dennis and Rachel Abraham from Move to End Violence faculty out to Idaho, I think 3 times last year. They're going to come out again the end of November here in Idaho, and just to help us to have deeper conversations about understanding both implicit and explicit bias, understanding power and privilege, and what that looks like, particularly for individuals like myself who are white, heterosexual, able-bodied, and how do we show up in this work with humility and dignity and doing it responsibly. So when I think about our work, it's shifted. I was telling some of our team members just a little while ago that I was looking at some of our youth engagement advisory or teen interns or employees we've had over the years. And, you know, I thought that we were pretty progressive even 6-7 years ago, and I looked back at photographs of the groups, and they were almost exclusively white young people. And it was because we recruited our youth engagement interns and employees from schools through counselors, and we tended, you know, to get applications almost disproportionately, almost exclusively from youth that were white. And so we had to really, as we shifted our work and our focus and our vision, it also began to shift who actually reached out to us to be a youth intern or youth activist with our organization. So these are 4 young women now that are among our youth activist leaders. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the trajectory of how that we got to this point. Just to know that it's been a journey. It's been an incredible journey. So looking at this slide, this is like when I was putting this together, I was almost horrified and embarrassed. But I want to like show kind of where we've been just so you can see. So we have always been doing prevention work since I've been at the coalition and had a really strong youth focus early on, almost 10 years ago. But you can look at our campaigns just to kind of get a sense of the trajectory of our organization. In 2007, oh my goodness, like this was our scary statistic phase, much like the rest of the country, just using, you know, I think we had all white youth featured in the posters, the statistics, you know, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 5, and for goodness sakes, why we had just torsos, I don't even know what we were thinking. I think it's really reflective of kind of where we were at that point. And then you can see in 2008, 2009, we were very much in a campaign called No Means No. I even look back at the posters, and I'm just kind of like stunned that even the young women are in very passive positions in retrospect or in you know, comparison to the young men. So in 2010, 2011, you know, we shifted to a Love What's Real campaign from the No Means No. And you can see over the course of time, we started to become more, a little bit more about empowerment and self-determination. And some of the language even got to be stronger. We started talking about things in 2011 around individuality and then inequality in 2012. And also about this point in time, our youth also started to reflect some of the communities and the states that we really were trying to reach. And so by 2013, we started to kind of like move in about the right direction, and our campaigns were featuring young women of color in more empowered and self-determined stances, you know, here fixing a bike. Other ones were showing young women as basketball players. But it really wasn't until, check with a couple numbers, in 2014 and 15 and 16, and this, no surprise, actually corresponds directly with my experience with Move to End Violence as a member of Cohort 2. For me, that particular experience was incredibly transformational in terms of shifting my worldview and just having a deeper understanding of the kind of impact that both I wanted to have over the course of my life and the organization. And so when I look at the posters in 2014, we started to lift up more social justice and social equity and liberation concepts. And all the young women in the posters are young women that work for us as youth activists. So Paige is in 2014. In 2015, that particular campaign featured a number of our youth. Criis is on that particular poster. In 2016, this past year, our youth camp with a really incredible, radical campaign, which actually featured folks like Audre Lorde and Dolores Huerta and Winona LaDuke and other, amazing Black, cis, queer, transgender women of color, activists and feminists that have been doing this work for decades and lifted up some of their words and their vision, but with the perspective of someone who was young, which were all young women of color. So for us, just actually looking at this trajectory of our organization is a way to both kind of ground us in where we were and understanding that where we are going and where we continue to go is such an essential change, because the work that we're doing now with young women of color has moved away from healthy relationships. We used to do a lot of work, and that was looked at from many folks around the country in terms of promoting healthy relationships. And I'm not saying that's not good work. It can be good work, but we had to really struggle with the question, is that the best and highest use of our time? And we figured out that it was not, for a couple of reasons. One is, I think the complexity of focusing around just healthy relationships is, again, you're looking at the antidote to violence on an individual level, and you're not looking at that systemic level. So I think about all the different trainings we were doing around healthy relationships, and just thinking about if a young person, a young woman of color being in the room that was experiencing racism, poverty, or other types of systemic oppressions that are inseparable from her life, that how in the heck was understanding respect and communication going to make a difference in her life? And what the unintended harm could have been in terms of putting that responsibility on her to change the conditions that are so broad and vast in our culture. And so for us, we have really, really shifted, and I think this has been such an important and needed shift for us to a much more robust youth organizing with the intersectional analysis. And so, I'm learning from folks like Joanne, who have been, she has been doing this work with young women of color for, many years now, and getting a lot of traction both, not just in Brooklyn and to the White House, but across the country. And it has certainly influenced the kind of work that we do here in Idaho. So here's our group of youth interns that we had last year. One of the questions that we still have, and Joanne, I don't know the answer for us, and we were talking about this earlier even today, that we've always had a group of youth that represent across the gender spectrum in terms of just focusing on girls of color. We're also at the same time trying to create spaces just for girls and young women of color to come together and trying to do a both and. Not an either or, but a both and. And so when I think about our youth last year, they were youth that were queer, youth with disabilities, youth of color, youth who were refugees or had come to this country as refugees, and that brought just this wealth of experience and perspectives and lived experiences that really helped and shaped, informed, and really led the work that we do. So differences would be, we still do some of the same kinds of initiatives, but with a much different kind of lens and perspective. So we have always had a large, robust writing contest, a writing challenge where 3,000 youth from around the state participate. So where the prompts last, 5 years ago would have been writing more about a healthy relationship. This year's prompts are prompts, like who are your people and what happened to them and what does community healing look like? Prompts around liberation. What would collective liberation look like? And so this is a visual from chalk art. We have a chalk art contest challenge that comes after the writing challenge in the spring, where we invite high schools and junior highs from around the state to participate. So you can see this would have been one probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and great high school group, great junior high group, and they did a great visual. But we go to this year, and it's much more empowered. Here we have Buki, one of our leaders, who's speaking to the press. I think one of the things that I've learned from just listening deeply to Joanne and watching her is just creating the conditions for young women to thrive and to lead. And so whenever we have events, it is the young people who are stepping up forward or the ones speaking to the press And here's Dookie at like one of our chalk art events from just this past April. And again, so who is showing up in terms of artists? We're reaching more young women from underserved and marginalized communities representing, racial and ethnic diversity in Idaho, the LGBTQ community as well. And so when I think about the kind of work that's generated, here's an example this year from both one of the poems and then the illustrations that were drawn by a high school group. And so it's so much deeper and richer and reflective of the community that we're trying to reach. And so it's just exciting to see how just this very important shift in our perspective has begun to shift and transform everything else. The other piece that we do is now we're creating spaces and learning all the ways that we can create the conditions for young women of color to thrive in our organization. I think it's important to mention that we have continued our journey in terms of when we first brought youth on, they were given stipends. Now they're actually hourly part-time employees. They're paid positions. They have flexible hours. We have staff that work nights and weekends to meet the schedules and the needs of our young people. We make sure we have plenty of food. Food is essential. If we need to pay mileage in order for youth to come to work, we pay mileage as well. And so they've really been shaping and shifting our campaign, our Gender Revolution campaign, which is on our website at www.engagingvoices.org, and you can order for free. It really had a great deal of traction from around the country. We had organizations and schools from over 40 states order it this year. We also had T-shirts that went along with the campaign. On the left here, you see a photograph of Fatima. We had a People of Color Poetry Slam one night. We also had a Young Women of Color workshop earlier this month. We had an event we co-sponsor with Boise State, bringing in Roxanne Gay. And when Boise State, said to the coalition, Kelly, can you go ahead and we would love for you to introduce Roxanne, it was just knowing that absolutely no question, the right thing to do was for me to step aside and say, actually, Bookie should be the one to introduce Roxanne. And what she did, an incredible, powerful opening. So the same thing, we had an opportunity to meet with Gloria Steinem just a few weeks ago. It was so important that we had a limited number of individuals that we could bring, that we made the space for the young women of color that work for our organization to go and to meet Gloria. And one of the things that happened that was so fun and exciting is right after we met Gloria, Bookie turned around and said, can I put one of my Black Lives Matter and Free Brescia buttons on you? And she said yes. And so she wore those, which really prompted conversations the rest of that evening with everybody that was at that event. So it's like creating the conditions and opportunities so they can thrive. And so I'll just end with this slide again. I'm so hopeful. These are the young women that are leading us this year that have just started. We're building a youth network throughout the state and really in particular focusing and highlighting and reaching out to young women of color. And just want to thank you again, Joanne, for your leadership. We learn from you, we watch you, we see you, and we love you.
Thank you, Kelly. You're doing amazing work. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to you both. Wow, this is just such an incredible amount of information to have shared with us, and I'm so happy that you did. I want to leave time for questions too, but I just want to make a quick comment. You both spoke a lot to vision into kind of making sure that in our visioning process that we're also holding a space for intentional shifts in our work. And Joanne, I just really loved something that kind of hit home for me is just how important that intentional process is around visioning for youth, and particularly youth of color, and I think for agencies as well. And just kind of posing the questions, what would the world be like without transphobia, without racism, without these things, and then building out concrete steps around what that collective vision. That's incredibly important, and I think I think you both spoke a lot to, again, making the intentional shift to power sharing, both organizationally and in terms of particular identities and making sure that youth organizations and leaders from various communities share power with youth and bring them into the fold in terms of giving them those leadership opportunities, and also making sure that white folks and white organizations, or predominantly or historically white organizations, are being intentional about sharing power and bringing voices of color into the space. And I feel like there's so much that we learned from you. Thank you so much to you both. I know that that there were a few questions posed, and I know that Joanne, you had a chance to answer one. I don't think I was seeing any other questions in the chat. If anybody has anything now that they'd like to pose, you're always welcome to hit the hand-raising button at the top left of your screen, and we can unmute you, or you can pose that question in the public chat. And maybe you're just soaking in all the information and want to go back and listen to this webinar or the recording. And we are happy to share our information. I'll put that up on the screen for you all. Feel free and reach out if there's a question about this content, or if you'd just like to follow up with more information or anything that that comes up for you.
This is Kelly. Just one quick note that I think Joanne, you had mentioned Brescia Meadows, and folks that don't know, she was a young 14-year-old in Ohio that was living in an incredibly abusive home and sought help, was unable to get it, and ended up shooting her father. But now she's been in juvenile detention for more than 70, 75, 80 days now. And so there's a lot of work going around, and I'll try to put the link on there, to free Brescia Meadows. It's just like a young Black girl does not need to be in juvenile detention. She needed community care and support around her for her healing, and it was so reflective of so many things that are wrong in our system in terms of the over-incarceration, particularly of young Black girls in juvenile detention, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong. And so there was an organizational petition that was going around. I just encourage organizations to get involved, to have your organization sign on, to encourage the prosecutor to release her, not just charge her as an adult, but just to release her. And so I don't know if you want to share any more, Joanne. I'll find the link and put it on the chat so people know where to go.
I think what you shared is exactly right, and I mean this is clearly a place for young people of color to enter even the dialogue, right? When we think about domestic violence and the work to combat it that our organizations do, so often, this isn't typically the case, right? She's not the perfect victim because she killed her father, but she really, is exactly what is wrong with the system when we talk about prevention, because she went to school and her grades started to drop, right? She was a great student. She's an avid reader, and her grades were dropping. That didn't catch the attention of the school administration and faculty. Community-wise, community organizers asked the community and polled the community and asked, is this a surprise? Did you know this was happening? The community said they thought actually her father would kill them by now. He actually brandished a gun in the community towards other people. He was aggressive and violent towards other people in the community. So the community didn't protect her or the family. And then when she ran away from home, she was brought back by a police officer who then proceeded to interview her in front of her father about why it is that she ran away. So then the criminal justice system didn't protect her. So again, then left feeling like the last alternative was him or them. She protected her family, and her mother calls her the hero because she did what she couldn't do. So, I mean, with this case right here, in real time, there's action that should be happening, but also a real internal dialogue within organizations around how these systems really, impact even the families that you're working with, and how it is also that then racial bias, right, impacts how you see criminalizing families or criminalizing perpetrators within families, because so many times communities of color families are not really calling the law because of such carceral measures that have gone to further incarcerate communities of color because of domestic violence. So there's a lot of work for us to do within this field to right some of that wrong and to shift some of these systems. So this isn't something that we can, wait for. This is something that our field has caused. And prevention, I'm glad it's here, but it's way overdue as a strong strategy on the spectrum of ending and combating gender-based violence.
The one piece I would add, Joanne, is that for us, in Idaho, we've had a number of free BRUSHA activities, and it's really been mobilizing particularly young girls, women of color at high school age, around BRUSHA's age, to come together to write letters to BRUSHA. Everyone should know that she was on suicide watch, not surprising, with the conditions of juvenile detention anywhere in our country. And so it's been just an essential time in our history to bring young girls of color together to talk about all the ways systemic impressions intersect and are inseparable, and how we just need a different way forward.
It's Lorianne, and I just wanted to bring this back to some of the, I just wanted to reframe, Kelly mentioned the challenge of this shift to the liberation of the last girl for preventionists, not just reaching out to the larger group, which is what we've been taught all along from the perspective of the public health model, but also stopping perpetration, which has really translated for all of us into prioritizing the engagement of boys and men really over girls and women, and that felt very right for a very long time. But what I appreciate about bringing up the Brusha Meadows case is that if people in domestic violence coalitions and local programs all throughout our country are looking for a way to enter this movement around, centering girls and young women of color, this is such a good way to do it, and it really can be a rallying cry. It's a letter writing campaign. It's making sure that we are able to pour our support to her so she knows that the world is watching. It's about really centering just the politics of all of this. It's really perfect as a central rallying point for domestic violence advocates all across the country, and I'm really glad we're ending on that note.
I think the piece I would add to that too, Lorianne, is just making sure that look, we are a mainstream organization and had been predominantly white, heterosexual, middle class folks working here, and so we've had to do a lot of our own internal work that is so essential, because one of the things is I would say you want to also just have a lot of humility. You don't want to step right into all of a sudden shifting your work and looking and focusing on young girls and women of color, because chances are there's already grassroots organizations in your community doing so. And so for us, it was about building relationships with Women of Color Alliance here in Idaho, Mujeres, the disability advocacy groups, folks like Girls for Gender Equity exist in many, many communities. And it's like being super transparent and just, and being willing and open to learn, but building those relationships and your own internal capacity for racial and gender justice work is just essential.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. And for those of you who didn't see, Kelly provided the free BRUSHA link. So if you'd like to bring this back to your organization and talk to the leadership there, or start a dialogue among staff around what an organizational endorsement or commitment looks like, this could be a first step in the process. And thank you, Kelly, for sharing that, and thank you, everyone, for kind of bringing up this call to action for us. Kelly, one of the things that I saw that came up in the chat box was a question about whether or not you could share some of your theory of change work that you were mentioning. and I know that might be kind of detailed notes and things like that, but I'm wondering if maybe you wouldn't mind speaking to that for just a minute.
Sure. And I'm happy to share a theory of change or a strategic framework is actually a one-page visual, so I'm happy to send that to folks. Okay. And know that it took us, it was like almost 9 months working with an organizational development consultant, Geraldine Coffey out of Oakland. We had, at her suggestion and recommendation, had a small group of staff, which it was essential to have staff that were across the organization in terms of, lived experiences, positional authority, just because you were wanting a really kind of as broad a perspective as you could have, as well as, again, a few board members. And so we spent a great deal of time thinking about what were like the 5 organizational values that would define all the work that we would do. What was our focus? And for us, our focus in the end is really being accountable to girls and cis and trans girls and young women and people who are gender nonconforming, youth and young adults. And so that process, it was really robust, and then we started to live into it. And once we started to live into it, it was messy. I mean, it was hard for people to kind of see that we were shifting, because if you even think about the parable of the river and on the bank, we had been pulling people out mostly into the criminal justice system, and we had to really reconcile that the harm that the criminal justice system was causing across our country in terms of over-incarceration, I mean, it wasn't working. And it's not working actually for survivors of gender-based violence as well. So, I mean, it was a very intensive process. It's something we're still living into. It's a living, breathing document. I'm happy to share the one page with everybody, and as well as some of the authorization and the language that goes with it. But happy to, if anyone wants to email me, or I can send it to you all, and you all can post it, whatever's easiest. I sometimes don't put it out on webinars because when you look at it, it can be a little overwhelming.
Yeah. Thank
you. It's like looking at my tax records or something, So.
Yeah. Sometimes the internal dialogue in an agency can just be a little bit much. But yeah, I appreciate you being willing to share that. And yeah, folks, reach out to Kelly if you would like to see that, and maybe we will try and include that in the things that we post. Just as a reminder, this recorded session will be posted on vaunet.org and preventipv.org, and it should be up by the end of this week. Also, as a reminder, if you would please, I believe, and Justine and Lorianne, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe when you X out of this webinar session, there will be an evaluation feedback form that pops up. And so we want to hear more about what you'd like to see and how this met your needs and how you're actually going to take this information back to your agency and move it forward. And please check out Prevent IPV and give us feedback on our resources and all the things that we have going on there, and sign up for the newsletter and stay involved. Joanne and Kelly, we so appreciate you sharing your expertise with us, and I'm really excited to see how folks are going to take this back and maybe start a conversation at their agencies, in their communities, and really kind of feel supported in shifting their work if they haven't already. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your work. I love you, Kelly.
Thank you, Joanne. I love you, too. Thank you, everyone, for listening in.
So thank you, everyone. Feel free to sign off now. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.